The arena pulsed with lights that flickered like wildfire. Giant screens flashed the name Blake Boneyard Maddox in bold silver letters as music boomed through the rafters, drowning out the human roar. Smoke cannons erupted from each corner of the walkway, and the crowd rose to its feet as their champion swaggered through the tunnel, sunglasses on despite the indoor glare. He moved like someone who knew every eye was on him, each step punctuated by camera shutters and chant-like cheers. Sponsorship logos danced on his robe woven with neon threads, as if every fiber of fabric had something to sell. Fans held signs bearing his likeness stylized into a mythic caricature, part warrior, part brand. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, beneath the blinding light and sound, a man entered without announcement. He didn't have an entourage. He didn't need one. Chuck Norris, in a dark, collared jacket and loose jeans, moved along the aisle with the slow, steady walk of someone unafraid of being unseen. The usher tried to confirm his seat number, but Chuck just nodded politely and sat down 3 rows from the cage, resting both hands gently on his knees. Around him, no one noticed at first. Then 1 person turned. Then 2. But they didn't point or scream. They just looked, then looked away as if they sensed they shouldn't disturb what was quietly forming in that seat. In the row behind him sat Linda Ray. She wore a press badge clipped to her simple black blazer and held a recorder loosely in one hand. Her pen hovered over a blank notepad, but she hadn't written a word yet. Her eyes kept darting forward, drawn to the shape of the man she hadn't seen in over 20 years. Chuck hadn't changed much. Older, yes. Slower in posture, perhaps. But something about the way he sat still, composed, unhurried, reminded her exactly why she once chose him as a mentor. Not because of his fame, not because of the movies, but because of the way he once walked her out of a panic attack without saying more than 6 words. In the cage, Blake bounced on his heels, throwing air punches for the cameras. He flashed a grin at the billionaire seated ringside and gave a playful wink to a famous pop star across the aisle. His world had grown fast. He'd become more than a fighter. He was a movement now, or maybe a machine. The commentator's voice cut through the din. They called Blake a new breed of combat athlete. They praised his undefeated streak, his flair, and his control of media narratives. Not once did they mention his opponent, a quiet Brazilian grappler who was brought in at the last minute to make the card work. The match was just the preamble. Everyone knew that. What they really came for was the post-fight announcement. The unveiling of his clothing line, his new NFT partnership, and the teaser trailer for his streaming docuseries. The fight was a formality. What mattered was the brand launch. Linda leaned forward and whispered, not expecting a reply. "You're not here for the fight, are you?" Chuck didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the cage. "I'm here for what comes after," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but somehow she heard it over the chaos. The bell rang. It was over in less than 2 minutes. Blake played with his opponent before ending the fight with a flying elbow that barely grazed the man's cheek. The referee stopped it as the Brazilian dropped, covering up instinctively. The crowd roared again. Fireworks were fired from the rafters. Blake climbed the cage and beat his chest, pointing to the sky, then down at his own name on the jumbotron. He shouted something to the cameras, though no one could quite hear it. Not that it mattered. The narrative would be stitched together later on TikTok and Instagram anyway. When he grabbed the mic, everything quieted, not because of respect, but anticipation. He thanked the crowd with charm. thanked his sponsors. Then his tone shifted. He talked about legends, about how people still romanticize the past, about how old-school martial artists spent more time reminiscing than evolving. He called them museums of sweat and regret. Said the world didn't need monks, it needed monsters. The audience laughed. Linda's pen dropped. Chuck's eyes didn't blink. Then Blake did something odd. He turned toward the lower seats, scanning the crowd as if expecting someone. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe something felt off. He raised the mic again. If any of those dinosaurs are in here tonight, this is your chance. Come show the world what silence can do. A hush rolled through the lower bowl. Chuck stood. He didn't raise his hand, didn't flex. He just looked at Blake and nodded once. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't angry. It was enough. The camera caught it by accident. It flashed on the big screen for a split second before switching away like it had shown something it didn't understand. People started murmuring. Linda stood without realizing it. Then the light around Chuck seemed to shift. Not brighter, not louder. But suddenly, the noise didn't reach him. Like there was an invisible perimeter around his seat, and inside it was something the crowd hadn't seen in a long time. Something grounded. Something real. Blake squinted. Chuck sat back down. He didn't speak again. Linda finally wrote her first words of the night. Boneyard just stepped into something he doesn't recognize, and the air in the arena had started to change. Here is part 2. The Crown of Noise, written in continuous prose with full adherence to your tone, emotion, and structure guidelines. The music had barely faded when Blake grabbed the microphone. He didn't wait for the official interview. He turned his back to the referee, motioned for the cameras to zoom in, and raised the mic like a man holding court over an empire. His chest still glistened with sweat, but his voice rang dry, controlled, rehearsed. He smiled like someone who already knew what headlines would read tomorrow. He walked slowly in a circle around the cage, making sure to glance at every camera angle, giving them all a few seconds of that signature glare. The crowd hadn't even settled yet. They were still cheering and laughing high on his victory. But Blake wasn't satisfied with cheers. He wanted the moment. He cleared his throat into the mic. They say we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? A few cheers followed. But then his voice turned just slightly. Well, sometimes I wonder if those giants even knew how to walk. Laughter rippled through the lower bowl. Blake paced again, his grin widening. We've built this sport from sweat and scars. But too many guys from the so-called golden age still think their black belts mean something now. They're like dusty books in a digital world. Decorative, sentimental, heavy. A few older fans in the audience stopped clapping. Blake shrugged. I mean, come on. You've seen the old tapes. Slow-motion push kicks, wooden boards, kata drills in white pajamas. Look, I respect the effort, but the game has moved on. The laughter now grew louder, younger. He gestured toward the back rows, toward no one in particular. If any of them are still alive and feeling brave tonight, the mic is yours. Let's see what tradition has to say when the bell rings. It was meant as a joke. But the crowd didn't laugh this time. The rhythm shifted. Some people turned their heads instinctively as if they felt the air move in a different direction. And that's when Chuck stood up. He didn't raise a fist. He didn't step forward. He just stood calmly and quietly, hands at his sides. A man whose name hadn't been called, whose moment was long past, but whose presence made noise without sound. Blake paused mid-sentence. He saw him now. The cameras didn't cut away this time. The big screen stayed locked on Chuck's face. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. I just looked into the cage like someone was studying a photograph from a long time ago. Blake chuckled. Well, I'll be damned. He leaned forward against the cage wall mic, still hot. Mr. Norris. Sir. I didn't think they sold tickets that far back in time. A few people laughed. It was forced. Chuck didn't react. Blake smirked. You want a seat in the cage? Come earn it. Chuck finally spoke. Just one round. He didn't raise his voice, but somehow everyone heard it. The arena froze. Blake blinked. Come again. Chuck nodded once. One round. No talking. Then he sat down. There was no fanfare, no music, no slow-motion camera zoom, just gravity. It was the first time Blake didn't know what to say. He looked at the referee, then at the crowd, then back to Chuck, who now sat with his arms folded across his lap, as still as a tree no wind could move. The commentators didn't speak. They looked at each other, unsure if they were witnessing a joke or the start of something else entirely. The commissioner appeared at cage-wide. There was a short, hushed exchange. Legal staff huddled near the apron. A few glances were exchanged with the production crew and security. Phones rang. Screens flickered. Lawyers blinked fast. Then came the announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, with special executive approval and mutual consent from the participants, a 3-minute exhibition round will take place right now. The crowd erupted. Half stood in disbelief. The other half screamed like it was the 4th of July. Blake paced inside the cage, shaking his head in amusement, jaw loose, half grinning. Is this real? He asked, laughing to himself. Chuck didn't answer. He was already walking down the aisle. The arena split open like the sea. He passed through without touching anyone, eyes forward, steps measured. No one tried to stop him. No one knew how. It didn't feel like a stunt. It felt ceremonial. Linda Ray stood up and watched from the press box, notebook forgotten. She didn't write anything this time. She just breathed slowly. Blake leaned against the cage wall, chuckling as Chuck climbed the steps. Guess it's your funeral, Grandpa. Chuck stepped through the ropes. No gloves, no pads. Just calm. The referee gave a short nod, unsure of what protocol applied. There was no handshake, no touch of gloves. Just two men, one young and thunderous, the other quiet and older than the sport itself, standing in the center of a cage that suddenly felt more like a dojo. The bell hadn't even rung yet, but the silence already had. The bell rang, but no one moved. Chuck stood with his arms relaxed at his sides, his feet steady, eyes fixed on the man in front of him like he was observing the weather from the horizon. Blake bounced once, then twice, loosening his shoulders. The crowd expected an explosion. He gave it to them. Blake came in fast, a sharp jab, a high kick, a spinning elbow meant for show and speed. Each strike sliced through space where Chuck had just been. But Chuck wasn't there anymore. He hadn't stepped away so much as allowed the air to shift him. The crowd roared at first, then paused, then watched. Chuck hadn't thrown a single punch. He hadn't even raised his hands. His weight barely shifted like he'd been rooted into the mat long before the cage was built. Blake launched a side kick that would have broken ribs. Chuck turned his body half an inch and the kick passed through the shadow. People leaned forward in their seats. Blake reset. He moved again faster this time, adding feints, changing angles. His gloves cracked the air. The canvas thudded beneath his footwork. But Chuck wasn't fighting. He was witnessing. There was no aggression in his stance, no tension in his jaw, only stillness. Blake threw a hook and followed with a spinning back fist, a move that usually ended matches. Chuck tilted slightly, and both missed by less than a breath. Not once did he blink. A strange quiet began to spread through the lower rows. It wasn't boredom. It was reverence. Something was happening that didn't fit the rules. Chuck wasn't defending. He wasn't reacting. He was listening. Not with ears, but with the body. With skin. With silence. Blake exhaled hard. The sweat was already dripping from his neck. He circled again, half in disbelief. His legs moved faster, but his strikes grew sloppier. Power without a target, speed without contact, motion without meaning. Chuck just stood. The crowd, once raucous, now sat back in their seats. Phones stopped recording. People forgot what they came to see. What remained was a kind of awe that didn't need commentary. Linda sat motionless in the press box. Her pen rested quietly on her notebook. She wasn't writing. She was breathing. Chuck's eyes didn't follow the punches. They followed the man. His shoulders, his breath, his rhythm. He saw the storm inside Blake before it ever showed in his fists. Blake let out a growl and launched a flying knee. Chuck stepped half a foot to the left. The knee missed everything. Blake landed off balance, caught himself, and spun around. Chuck hadn't moved further. He simply waited. There were no cheers now. No noise at all. Just the steady pulse of a building realizing it was watching something older than combat, deeper than winning. Blake hesitated. Not because he was tired, but because for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do next. Chuck breathed. That was all. Blake shifted his stance again, this time wider, more calculated. He wasn't trying to show off now. He was trying to land something. Anything. His gloves twitched in the space between them like he was drawing maps on air, trying to guess which way the mountain might move. Chuck remained still, not frozen, but present. He wasn't waiting. He was aware. Every slight shift in Blake's weight seemed to pass through Chuck like a whisper he'd already heard. Blake lunged forward with a low kick meant to bait a reaction. Chuck didn't respond. Blake followed with a stiff jab, then another, then feinted high and swept his foot low. Nothing connected. But then Chuck stepped forward. It wasn't aggressive. It was small, a half step into Blake's rhythm, and with the back of his hand he tapped Blake's shoulder. It shouldn't have meant anything. But Blake stumbled. His heel caught behind him like his own weight had turned against him. He didn't fall, but his body jolted with surprise like gravity had bent sideways. He recovered and stepped back, shaking it off, forcing a smile toward the crowd. But no one laughed. Chuck was still there. Same spot, breathing slowly. Blake frowned. He came in again. This time he faked a right and spun into a left hook. Chuck didn't flinch. He barely tilted his head. The glove passed an inch from his temple. Blake pressed forward, trying to close the distance. But every time he did, it widened. Chuck wasn't backing up. He was creating space without moving, like his calm pushed out from him in waves. Blake attacked again, this time with sharp footwork, a head-body-head combo, the kind that usually overwhelmed opponents by sheer tempo. Chuck touched his wrist. That was all, and Blake's next punch went wide. He blinked. A drop of sweat slid down his nose. The rhythm was gone. He'd trained for speed power angles, but not this. He was throwing into a void. It felt like sparring with smoke. Chuck hadn't hit him once, yet he was losing. Worse, he didn't understand how. The timer ticked louder in his head. His breathing grew heavier, his shoulders tighter. He rolled them, shook out his arms, and tried to reset. But his heartbeat no longer matched the pace of his body. Something inside was unraveling. Chuck stepped to the right. Blake followed. Chuck pivoted left. Blake hesitated. That moment, that pause was new. No hesitation from the strategy, but from doubt. And in that crack, the storm began to leak. Chuck didn't exploit it. He respected it. But Blake's mind did not. He attacked again, wilder this time. A jump knee, a double jab, a spinning elbow. Chuck sidestepped and placed one palm on the center of Blake's chest. Blake froze just for a second, not because it hurt, but because it felt like someone saw through him, through the noise, the record, the brand, the body. Chuck stepped back. Blake remained still. That touch lingered longer than any knockout, and for the first time in his career, Blake realized he didn't need to be hit to be defeated. Blake steadied his breath and wiped his brow with the back of his glove. His eyes locked on Chuck, still unmoved, still unreadable. This had gone on longer than he expected, longer than it should have. He needed to finish it. He bounced on his heels more out of habit than confidence now. The crowd remained hushed, as if the building itself had leaned in to listen. His coach shouted something from the side, but Blake didn't hear it. Or maybe he chose not to. One last move. He knew the sequence, his signature, the spinning heel kick. It had ended fights, broken jaws, made highlight reels. It was the mark of his identity, the stamp of his name in motion. He turned his hip sharply, twisting his core, unleashing the spin with everything he had left. His heel sliced through the air like a blade aimed at Chuck's temple with precision and grace. But Chuck wasn't there. He had already stepped off the line. No rush, no flinch, just a slight movement, as if he'd anticipated not just the strike, but the thought behind it. And as Blake's foot passed through emptiness, his body carried by the momentum, Chuck reached out, one hand placed gently on Blake's shoulder, not to stop him, just to meet him. Their eyes met, and Chuck whispered, "You already lost." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They sank. Blake's legs stopped moving. His breath caught. His hands dropped not from pain, but from something heavier, like he had just heard something meant only for him. Not as a fighter, but as a man. The arena stayed frozen. Thousands of people watched a man stand perfectly still after the most beautiful move of his life missed its mark. Not because it was wrong, but it was never needed. Blake didn't fall. He didn't speak. He just stood there. It was as if someone had gently peeled away every layer of who he thought he was, and underneath the noise, the sweat, the brand, and the power, he saw it, the silence, and it saw him back. The room was quiet except for the hum of the overhead light. Blake sat alone on the bench, his elbows resting on his knees, his taped hands hanging limp between them. Sweat had dried on his back, and his skin itched under the edge of his gloves, but he didn't move. The mirror across from him showed a man he no longer recognized. His face was the same. The bruises, the cut above his brow, the line of his jaw, all familiar. But the eyes had changed. Something behind them had gone dim. He stared at himself like he was looking at an old photo from a life that had moved on without him. There were no reporters at the door, no celebration crew, no sponsor teams holding champagne bottles, just his bag in the corner and the echo of something he didn't have words for. He looked down at his hands, slowly peeled the tape from his fingers, one strip at a time. It came off too easily, like the night had already started to forget him. A soft knock broke the silence. He didn't look up. The door creaked open. She stepped in slowly, carefully, as if entering a place of mourning. Linda Ray didn't say anything at first. She just stood near the door and waited. Blake didn't move. She took a breath. "I'm not here for a quote." He didn't respond. She stepped a little closer, her voice low. "I saw what happened." Still nothing. Then she said the thing that pulled him up from the floor of himself. "Do you actually want to change?" He looked at her. His face didn't react. But something behind the eyes twitched like a wire reconnecting for the first time in years. She sat on the bench opposite him, not as a reporter, not as a fan, just someone who had once been broken enough to start over. "Chuck did the same thing to me once," she said. He blinked. "I was 22. Just got fired from a local station. Thought I was the next Barbara Walters. Instead, I was a mess." He looked at her for the first time. He didn't say it out loud, but it was in his eyes. "What did he do?" She smiled softly. "He made me sit still until I hated myself less." Blake swallowed. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty this time. It was full of something waiting. He leaned back, eyes toward the ceiling. "Do you ever feel like you built everything wrong?" Linda nodded. "Every day. Until I stopped building." He closed his eyes. "I don't know what I am without this." She leaned in. "Then that's exactly where you start." He opened his eyes again, softer now. He didn't nod, didn't make a speech. But his shoulders lowered just a little. And that was enough. The silence between them held more than any applause ever could. The gravel crunched under his boots as he stepped up to the porch. It was early. The kind of morning where the sun barely warmed the wood and the wind still smelled like dew. Blake paused at the door, his hand hovering over the old brass knocker. He had driven 2 hours without turning on the radio. No music, no podcast, just the hum of the engine and the thrum of his own mind playing questions he hadn't answered yet. He looked at the door again, steadying himself, then knocked. It was a quiet knock. Nothing dramatic. Nothing performative. A minute passed. Then the door opened. Chuck didn't smile. He didn't frown either. He just looked at Blake like he'd been expecting him since before the fight ever happened. Blake shifted his weight. Chuck opened the door wider and stepped back. Blake walked in. The house smelled like cedar and old books. The kind of space built for thought, not for guests. There were no trophies, no framed posters, just soft light and quiet wood. Chuck motioned to the table. Sit. Blake did. Chuck disappeared into the kitchen. There were no questions, no words like what changed your mind or what are you looking for, just the whistle of a kettle and the sound of 2 mugs placed gently on wood. Chuck poured the tea. Blake wrapped his hands around the cup, not to drink, but to anchor himself. His knuckles looked different now without the gloves. Smaller, more human. Chuck sat across from him. Still no questions. Just silence. Blake took a breath. Chuck nodded once like he'd been waiting for that. Then he spoke. The first lesson is the breath. Blake looked up. That's it. Chuck held his gaze. That's everything. They sat for a while like that. No pressure to fill the air. No need to explain. Just 2 men and the sound of steam rising from tea. Blake didn't know what he expected when he came, but somehow this was harder than any fight he'd ever walked into, and that's how he knew he was in the right place. The room had no mirrors, no mats, no punching bags, just empty floor and morning light spilling across the old wood like time had decided to slow down in here. Chuck sat cross-legged by the window. He said nothing, just closed his eyes and breathed. Blake sat across from him, stiff at first, knees creaking in protest. He kept his eyes open, watching. Minutes passed. The silence grew thick. Blake shifted. Then again. A breath, then a sigh. His thoughts moved faster than his lungs. He tried to match Chuck's rhythm, but it felt fake. Forced. Like copying a song without hearing the melody. He opened one eye and glanced at Chuck. Still. Unmoved. Blake frowned. He tapped his finger on his knee. He cleared his throat. He exhaled harder, hoping for a reaction. Nothing. Chuck didn't instruct, didn't correct, only existed. And that somehow was worse. Blake's mind screamed. What is this? He wanted movement, sweat, contact, something to prove he was still himself. But this was like staring into a still pond and seeing every crack beneath the surface. He stood up, paced once, sat back down. Chuck remained quiet. Blake clenched his jaw. An hour passed, or maybe just 10 minutes. He couldn't tell. Without distraction, time had no shape. Just wait. Eventually, Chuck opened his eyes. He didn't look at Blake. He stood and walked to a drawer, pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded it once, laid it gently in front of him. Tomorrow, he said, bring this back, with one name on it. Not the fighter, the man. Then he turned and walked away. Blake stared at the paper. blank. Like everything he thought he had just been erased. And for the first time, he didn't rush to fill it. The lights dimmed in the arena, but no music played. No voice boomed through the speakers. No fog rolled in. No announcer stretched the syllables of a fight name. Just the soft hush of expectation as people realized something was different. Blake walked toward the cage in silence. No hoodie, no banner team, just plain shorts and a steady breath. The crowd murmured. Some rose from their seats. Others leaned forward. No one quite knew what they were witnessing, but they knew it didn't belong to the spectacle anymore. Blake entered through the side gate. He didn't look around. He didn't lift his hands. He simply bowed his head once and stepped inside. The cage closed behind him. Across from him stood another fighter. Younger, taller, built like a machine. The kind of opponent made for pay-per-view. Blake bowed again. His eyes were steady, calm, present. The bell rang. They met in the center. There was no rush, no flying kick, no look-at-me combinations. Just movement. Measured. Clean. Balanced. Blake blocked without panic, countered without flourish. His breathing was even. Each motion came from somewhere deeper than reaction. It came from stillness. The crowd quieted. No cheers. No chants. Only the sounds of footwork and impact. The rhythm of control without aggression. His opponent swung wide. Blake stepped inside the arc and placed a short, clean palm to the chest. Not to hurt. To interrupt. It landed like a statement. Round after round passed like this. Blake didn't dominate. He didn't overpower. He aligned. Each strike carried only what was needed. Each dodge came not from calculation, but clarity. He fought like water filling a shape. And by the final bell, the shape had changed. His opponent stood across from him breathing heavily, blinking with the realization that he hadn't been beaten. He had been met. And Blake bowed, then turned and left the cage. No celebration, no arms raised, just stillness. The crowd rose anyway, not in excitement, in respect. They didn't cheer like fans. They stood like students. Blake took the mic only because they handed it to him. He held it for a moment, then spoke. It's not the fight that changed me. It's the silence around it. He stepped back. That was all. And in the third row, Chuck stood. Not to wave, not to be seen. He simply turned and walked away. The crowd parted without knowing why. Not to follow, but to witness a path that didn't need a spotlight to be real.